Imagine stepping into a world where the walls of a home do more than shelter, they guard generations of silence, pain, and secrets that most people could never fathom. Where family traditions aren't celebrated, but feared. Where whispers aren't shared, they're inherited. This is not a tale born from novels or cinema. This is the unsettling reality of Betty Whittaker and the family whose name has become synonymous with secrecy, survival, and a lineage that feels like a legend told in hushed tones. The Whittakers of West Virginia have long been cast into the public eye as one of America's most infamous families. Yet the truth, the raw, unpolished reality, is far darker and far stranger than any outsider could have imagined. And at the center of this storm of bloodlines, rumors, and haunting truths stands Betty Whittaker, the quiet matriarch who has carried more than her share of burdens, responsibilities, and secrets. Betty was not born into choice. She was born into inheritance, an inheritance that wasn't about money, land, or material legacy, but about cycles. Cycles that stretched back decades, carried forward through whispered arrangements and tightly sealed family doors. The Whittaker name became a mark of both recognition and ridicule, a subject of fascination and fear. Growing up in that house, Betty never knew the freedoms many take for granted. The world outside seemed more myth than reality. Her world was one of silence rooms where secrets lingered like shadows, where the air itself seemed heavy with judgment and shame. For Betty, childhood was not innocence but indoctrination, where the rules were set not by choice but by generations of decisions no one dared challenge. And yet, amidst this silence, Betty noticed. She saw things most others ignored. She understood the subtle shifts in tone, the hidden glances between relatives, the stories that didn't add up. As a young girl, she watched siblings change in ways that baffled her. Their physical and mental struggles told a story far bigger than any single lifetime. To the outside world, these were shocking. To Betty, they were reality. The family's isolation wasn't just geographical, it was genetic. Locked away from the broader community, the Whittakers became an ecosystem unto themselves. Cousins married cousins. Choices shrank until there was no longer choice at all, only inevitability. The human cost of this isolation showed itself in the bodies and minds of Betty's brothers, sisters, and cousins' stories written into flesh and memory. But unlike so many before her, Betty survived with awareness. She knew there was a world beyond the mountains, beyond the house, beyond the silence. She understood that the fragile existence her family clung to was both a shield and a curse. To protect it meant to continue the secrecy. To expose it meant unraveling everything. As the years passed, Betty's role grew. She became more than a daughter, more than a sister. She became the matriarch. The one who knew the stories but carried them quietly. The one who bore the shame of judgment from the outside world, yet still held her family together in the face of ridicule and whispers. For Betty, survival wasn't about living, it was about protecting. And yet, what makes Betty's story so haunting is the depth of secrets she carried. Outsiders thought they understood the Whittakers. Strange, isolated, different, but the truth goes deeper than any rumor. Inside that house, inside those walls, were truths that could shake even the most hardened heart. The outside world sees shocking faces in photographs, awkward stares in interviews, snippets of lives captured through lenses. But Betty? Betty saw the unfiltered truth. The tragedies that were never spoken of. The confessions whispered late at night. The desperation of people trapped in cycles they didn't choose but couldn't escape. And this is where the story sharpens its edge. Because Betty's survival wasn't passive, it was active. She cataloged, remembered, connected the threads that no one else could. Every conversation was a clue. Every silence a strategy. Every shadow in that house, a secret begging not to be exposed. What outsiders can never understand is that silence, in the Whittaker home, was never peace. Silence was survival. A word spoken in the wrong tone could mean exposure. A secret uttered aloud could destroy what fragile balance remained. And so, silence became the language of the family. Silence was both shield and prison. As Betty entered her teenage years, she began to understand the enormity of her burden. The house was no longer just shelter, it was a vault. a vault filled with decades of mistakes, regrets, and hidden truths. She learned to read between lines, to understand stories left unfinished, to recognize that history repeats itself whether or not anyone wants it to. The Whittaker family wasn't just trapped by geography, they were trapped by history, by choices made decades earlier, by the weight of isolation that turned inward until it twisted itself into their very DNA. Betty saw it in her relatives' eyes. She heard it in their voices. She felt it in the very walls of that home. There were corners in the house that no one dared enter, doors that remained locked, rooms heavy with memory. Stories floated through those halls, stories of lives cut short, of illnesses that made no sense, of disappearances left unanswered. For Betty, childhood was a daily reminder that her family's past wasn't just history, it was present. And yet, amid the despair, there were fragments of humanity. Betty found laughter in stolen moments, comfort in small acts of love. She discovered resilience in places where no one expected it. The Whittakers may have been trapped, but they were human, flawed, scarred, but human. And it was this humanity that kept Betty from giving up entirely. But here's where the twist begins. The deeper Betty looked, the more she realized that not every secret could remain buried. Some truths demanded to be seen, no matter the cost. And Betty, burdened as she was, knew that her choices would define not only her own life but the fragile legacy of every generation before her. By the time she entered adulthood, Betty saw the family home for what it was: not just shelter, not just prison, but labyrinth. A living maze of secrets, each one darker than the last. Conversations circled back like echoes. Warnings repeated like curses. Traditions felt less like heritage and more like chains. Fear followed her at every step. There were doors she refused to open, objects she dared not touch. Older relatives whispered of tragedies long buried, accidents that didn't feel accidental, illnesses that no doctor could explain. The outside world was oblivious. Inside, the house itself felt alive, echoing every secret, every betrayal, every unspoken truth. And then came the discovery. While searching through old family documents, Betty uncovered a diary from a relative long forgotten. The words on those pages were chilling. Lives so controlled, so confined, so crushed by silence that they read like horror disguised as memory. Every entry revealed the cost of secrets passed down like heirlooms, of choices that chained each generation tighter than the one before. It was then Betty realized her family's story wasn't just strange, it was tragic. It was a cautionary tale of what happens when isolation becomes identity, when silence becomes law, when survival erases freedom. And yet, through it all, Betty never turned her back. She remained tied to her family, bound by loyalty and love. Yes, they were flawed. Yes, they were scarred. But they were hers. And so, Betty continued carrying the weight of memory, protecting her family even as the truth threatened to destroy them. But every truth has a cost. And as Betty stood at the threshold of adulthood, she began to see that the line between survival and destruction was thinner than she ever imagined. Comment below, do you think Betty should have broken the silence and revealed everything she knew, or was she right to protect her family at all costs? The Whittaker family name had become a whispered warning in the hollers of West Virginia. Neighbors kept their distance, strangers gossiped, and rumors traveled faster than truth. But inside the house, Betty was not shielded from these judgments, she bore them. Every time the family was mentioned, it was her face that people looked to. Every whispered insult, every sideways glance landed squarely on her shoulders. And yet, she carried it all with the same quiet strength she had developed since childhood. The outside world might have seen tragedy, but Betty saw responsibility. She wasn't just a daughter or a sister, she was a protector. She understood that, for all their flaws, her family was still a family. And though their lives were shaped by choices they never truly made, their humanity demanded loyalty. But protection came at a cost. To protect meant to carry the weight of silence. To carry silence meant to live with the knowledge of things too dark to speak aloud. Betty knew this better than anyone. The walls that spoke there is an eerie truth about the Whittaker home. Outsiders called it strange, unsettling, even cursed. But for Betty, it was alive. She often said the walls seemed to hold memory, as though every secret spoken in whispers never left, instead lingering like smoke in the corners of the rooms. There were places she refused to enter, not because of physical danger, but because of the weight of history. Rooms where deaths had occurred. Rooms where fights had turned violent. Rooms where silence was so heavy it felt like breathing in dust from the past. And yet, she couldn't avoid them forever. The home was not large enough to escape its own memories. Betty learned to live with the echoes, to interpret them, to weave them into the story she was building in her own mind. Her family members lived in pattern cycles that repeated across generations. The same mistakes, the same behaviors, the same tragedies. Betty, ever observant, began to see these repetitions as warnings. She started to ask herself, was her family cursed by fate or trapped by choice? The diary. The discovery of the diary had shaken Betty in part one of her life's story, but its effect only deepened with time. She read and reread its entries, trying to piece together the mindset of a relative she had never known. The words were haunting descriptions of confinement, so intense they felt suffocating even years later. But what unsettled Betty most was the familiarity. The handwriting may have been old, the phrasing outdated, but the experiences mirrored her own. The diary became a mirror across time, showing her that nothing had changed. Her family was living the same cycle, bound by the same secrecy, carrying the same weight. This realization terrified her, because if nothing had changed in decades, then what hope was there for the future? Would her nieces, nephews, and cousins suffer the same fates? Would they too carry the scars of silence? Betty wrestled with this truth. On one hand, the diary gave her clarity. On the other, it crushed her hope. It told her that her family's story was not just history, it was prophecy. The outsider's gaze as time passed, attention from the outside world grew. Documentarians, journalists, curious strangers all sought to catch a glimpse of the Whittakers. Cameras flashed, microphones were extended, questions were asked. But what they captured was only fragments. The world saw the peculiar, the shocking, the strange. What they didn't see was the weight of silence Betty carried. What they didn't understand was that every interview, every documentary, every rumor put more pressure on her shoulders. She was not just dealing with judgment from her community, she was fighting the judgment of the world. Betty learned to navigate this with caution. She knew outsiders would never fully understand. They would sensationalize, dramatize, and exploit. And while she wanted the truth known, she also wanted her family protected. It was a contradiction she lived with daily. To expose was to betray, but to conceal was to suffer. The burden of memory, one of the cruelest truths Betty faced, was that memory can be both blessing and curse. She remembered everything, every fight, every whisper, every tragedy. She remembered the look in her mother's eyes when silence was chosen over truth. She remembered the confusion of her siblings, the struggles of her cousins, the bitterness of her neighbors, but she also remembered the small moments of love. A shared laugh in a darkened room, a hug when words failed, a glance of solidarity that said, "We may be trapped, but we are not alone." These moments, though fleeting, kept her going, yet memory is heavy and Betty bore it all. She became the family's historian, not by choice but by survival. Every story lived within her, every secret catalogued in her mind. And with each passing year, the weight grew heavier. The breaking point. The tension in Betty's life eventually reached a point where she could no longer ignore it. Secrets, once manageable, became overwhelming. Truths, once hidden, demanded light. And Betty, though loyal, began to realize that silence could no longer protect anyone. She had seen too much tragedies repeated, lives diminished, futures stolen. She had carried too much memories of things no one should have to remember. She had protected too long, shielding her family at the cost of her own peace. The question was no longer whether to speak, but how. How could she reveal truths that might destroy her family while still honoring the humanity of those she loved? How could she balance loyalty with survival? The line between survival and destruction grew thinner by the day, and Betty stood at its edge, knowing that whichever choice she made, the consequences would be enormous. Comment below, do you believe secrets protect families, or do they eventually destroy them? Imagine reaching a moment in life where silence no longer protects you, where the very secrets you've carried begin to claw at your sanity, demanding release. That's where Betty Whittaker found herself. For decades, she had been the vault, the keeper of stories too shocking, too painful, too heavy for the outside world to ever comprehend. But there comes a time when even the strongest shoulders bend beneath the weight of history. The Whittaker family was known for what outsiders called strangeness, but Betty knew it was deeper. Their reality wasn't strange, it was suffocating. For generations, choices had been stripped away, freedom traded for isolation, and silence mistaken for safety. By the time Betty reached her middle years, she knew that if she didn't begin to confront the shadows within those walls, they would consume her completely. The haunting patterns. Betty often spoke of the patterns that haunted her family. They weren't random. They were cyclical, almost ritualistic in the way they replayed across time. A cousin would fall ill under mysterious circumstances. A sibling would vanish into silence, their fate never fully explained. Rumors would flare up among neighbors, only to be stamped down by the family's impenetrable wall of secrecy. It wasn't just events, it was behavior. Betty noticed how her family members avoided certain words, avoided certain rooms, avoided certain conversations as though speaking them aloud would summon disaster. Glances lasted too long. Conversations circled back to the same half-finished warnings. She began to write these patterns down, quietly, in a small notebook she kept hidden under her mattress. Every whisper, every repetition, every peculiar ritual became an entry. Over time, the notebook filled with clues, threads that seemed disconnected until she saw them woven together into a chilling tapestry. The more she wrote, the more undeniable it became. The Whittaker family wasn't just unusual. They were carrying a generational trauma so deep, so corrosive, that it had become the very structure of their lives. The rooms of silence. By then, Betty had lived long enough to know that her house wasn't just a house, it was a labyrinth. Each room contained more than memories. They contained stories, secrets sealed into the very walls. One particular room haunted her more than the rest. It was small, with peeling wallpaper and a single wooden chair in the corner. Family members rarely entered it, and when they did, they left quickly, their faces pale, their words clipped. Betty could never get a straight answer about its history. Some said a child had died there. Others claimed it had once been used for punishments too cruel to name. She never received confirmation, but she didn't need it. The energy of that room told her everything. Stepping into it was like stepping into a void where time had stopped, where sorrow lingered in the air. She avoided it for years, but eventually curiosity pushed her across its threshold. She didn't find a body or blood or anything so dramatic. What she found was worse, a silence so absolute it felt like standing in the epicenter of every unspoken truth her family had buried. The diary's echo, the discovery of the old diary, had already unsettled Betty years earlier, but now it returned with new weight. She read it again. Only this time, she compared it to the notes she had written in her own secret notebook. The similarities were undeniable. Incidents described decades before matched perfectly with what she was experiencing now. The same illnesses, the same disappearances, the same fearful silences. It was as though time inside the Whittaker family had folded onto itself. Decades passed, but nothing changed. The past was not behind them. It was alive, living in their blood, their minds, their silence. Betty began to feel like she was reliving the diary, like her life was simply a continuation of a story written long before she was born. And if that was true, she feared she already knew how it would end. The outsiders returned. By the time documentaries and journalists began revisiting the Whittakers, Betty was torn. She had watched her family become a spectacle captured on camera, their images spread across the internet, their story dissected by millions who would never set foot in Appalachia. Some outsiders were curious, others were cruel. The family became content, their humanity reduced to shock value. Betty despised this, yet she also saw opportunity. Maybe if the world truly saw, truly listened, someone would understand. Maybe their suffering wouldn't be in vain. But there was always risk. Every time a camera came into the home, Betty feared what might be revealed, what judgment might follow. The world wanted spectacle, not truth. And truth, she knew, was too complicated, too painful to be packaged into neat sound bites. Still, the outsiders came, and Betty stood between them and her family, guarding, filtering, negotiating. She allowed some stories to be told while keeping others buried. Her silence remained her shield, confronting the past. The turning point came late one night when Betty stumbled upon a box in the attic. Inside were letters yellowed with age, written in shaky hands, signed by names she vaguely recognized. The letters told of tragedies she had never been told outright: a cousin who had drowned under suspicious circumstances, an uncle who had disappeared without explanation, a child born but never spoken of again. Each letter carried sorrow, but also fear. They spoke of keeping quiet, of not letting outsiders know, of protecting the family at all costs. The words were desperate, pleading, and terrifyingly familiar. For Betty, this was the confirmation she didn't want but could no longer deny. Her family's silence wasn't just cultural, it was enforced. It had been taught, repeated, demanded for generations. The Whittakers didn't just live in isolation. They lived in captivity to their own history. The breaking silence, Betty's decision to begin speaking, even in small ways, was not made lightly. She knew it would bring judgment, ridicule, even betrayal from her own family. But she also knew the alternative: a life spent suffocating under the weight of secrets too dark to carry alone. She began slowly sharing fragments with trusted outsiders, speaking carefully in interviews, hinting at truths that had never before been uttered aloud. Each word felt like a rebellion, each confession like breaking a chain. But freedom came with fear. What would happen if the full truth emerged? Would her family be destroyed? Would outsiders mock them even more? Or would silence finally loosen its grip? The balance was fragile. Betty was walking a tightrope, torn between loyalty to her blood and responsibility to herself. And she knew one thing with certainty: whichever path she chose, nothing would ever be the same again. The human cost. Through it all, Betty never forgot the humanity of her family. To outsiders, they were a spectacle. To her, they were flesh and blood, brothers who laughed awkwardly but sincerely, sisters who carried pain in their eyes, cousins who, despite their struggles, showed moments of kindness and joy. They were not monsters, they were not caricatures. They were human beings shaped by history, by isolation, by cycles no one had been brave enough to break. Betty loved them even as she mourned what had been stolen from them. This is what made her burden so heavy. To tell the truth meant exposing her family's wounds to the world. To stay silent meant continuing the cycle of suffering. It was a choice between betrayal and complicity, and there was no path without pain. The revelation yet to come as Betty stood in her kitchen one quiet morning, staring at the walls that had witnessed so much. She felt the weight of every secret pressing against her. She knew the day was coming when silence would no longer be possible. The world was watching, the cameras were rolling, and her family's story was too big, too strange, too tragic to remain hidden forever. Betty didn't yet know how the story would end. But she knew this: the line between survival and destruction was gone. What came next would not only define her, but redefine the Whittaker name for generations. Comment below. If you carried secrets that could destroy your family's reputation but also set you free, would you reveal them? Or would you stay silent? For decades, Betty had carried the burden of silence. She had lived as the matriarch of a family defined not by wealth or status, but by secrecy. Every memory, every tragedy, every whispered confession had been hers to protect. The walls of her house had become witnesses, and she their interpreter, but silence is never neutral. It does not protect forever, it festers, it corrodes, and Betty knew this better than anyone. Her body ached not from age alone, but from carrying stories too heavy for one person to bear. She thought often of her ancestors, their choices, their silences, their mistakes. She saw how the cycles repeated, how the chains tightened with each passing generation. And she realized something terrifying: if she did nothing, the cycle would continue. Her nieces and nephews, her cousins and their children, would inherit the same silence, the same suffering. For Betty, the question was no longer if she should speak, but when. The storm outside. The outside world's fascination with the Whittakers had only grown stronger. Documentaries spread across the internet. Photographs circulated endlessly. Millions of strangers speculated about their lives, their choices, their bloodlines. To some, the Whittakers were a curiosity. To others, they were a warning. But to Betty, they were simply family. She hated how the world reduced them to spectacle, ignoring the depth of their humanity. And yet, she couldn't deny the attention brought with it an opportunity. For the first time in generations, the Whittakers had a platform. People were listening. The world wanted to know. The danger was obvious, but so was the chance to finally speak the truth. The decision. Betty wrestled with her choice for years. Some nights she convinced herself silence was safer. Safer for her family. But other nights she lay awake, haunted by the thought that silence was nothing more than complicity. The diary she had discovered, the box of letters, her own hidden notebook, all were reminders that her family's history had already been written once in silence. And every time silence had won, suffering had followed. She didn't want to be the one who allowed the suffering to continue, so, slowly, carefully, Betty began to share more. She spoke to outsiders not with spectacle but with honesty. She revealed fragments of truth, testing the waters, gauging reactions. Some listened with compassion. Others judged. But with each word, the weight on her shoulders grew lighter. The truth was no longer locked away. The breaking of chains for Betty, speaking out was not about betrayal, it was about survival. She knew it would bring pain. She knew some family members would feel exposed, even endangered. But she also knew the silence had nearly killed her, and it had already destroyed too many before her. Breaking the cycle required courage. And courage, Betty discovered, is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act in spite of it. As she told more of her story, Betty began to see something unexpected, not just judgment, but understanding. Outsiders who once mocked her family began to see them differently, not as monsters, not as caricatures, but as human beings trapped in circumstances beyond their control. Her story, for all its darkness, became a mirror for others, a reminder that every family carries secrets, that silence, no matter where it lives, always carries a cost. The legacy. By the time Betty grew older, she knew her life had become more than survival. It had become testimony. She was no longer just the matriarch of the Whittakers. She was their historian, their voice, their reluctant messenger to the world. She could not erase the tragedies. She could not undo the choices of generations past. But she could refuse to let silence define the future. Betty's legacy was not in hiding secrets, but in revealing them, not in preserving silence, but in breaking it. And in doing so, she gave her family something they had not known for generations, a chance at honesty, however painful it might be. The final truth, the Whittaker story, is not neat. It is not comfortable. It is not one that ends with simple closure. It is messy, tragic, complicated, and haunting. But it is also deeply human. Betty Whittaker carried the weight of her family's darkest truths, and she bore them with strength few could match. In the end, she chose revelation over silence, courage over fear, humanity over secrecy. And in that choice, she proved something the world often forgets, that even in the darkest of stories, there is resilience, that even in the most broken families, there can be love, and that even in the heaviest silence, there is a voice waiting to be heard. Comment below. Do you think Betty's decision to break the silence was an act of betrayal or the ultimate act of love? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.